Back in the Himalayas, at the first presentation of the new Royal Enfield Himalayan, all we got was a brief taster. Now, at long last, we've had it in our hands and been able to put it properly through its paces. After a week crossing Slovenia through mud, gravel and barely any tarmac, Valentin behind the camera and I came to the conclusion that, in our opinion, there's nothing else on the market that gives you as much bike for your pound.
Oh, da eben! Oh! Aber schön umdreht ist das. Ich komme einfach gar nicht vom Fleck. Oh, gesteppert aus dem Nichts. Okay, ich weiß nicht, ob wir uns das antun können. Oh ja! Oh, 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 oh. Ah! Ah!
Greetings from the summit of Mount Slunica here in the south of Slovenia. Behind me you can see the Kerknika Lakes, quite well known at least in this part of the country. And yes, weather was nice again and our garage was full bikes. So we ended up taking the Tiger 900 Rally Pro and now the Royal Enfield Himalayan out for a tour. This time we're riding across Slovenia again, as we often do, but entirely on unknown tracks. We plotted our route beforehand on the Garmin Basecamp software at the computer. It was actually quite interesting because there was a lot of guesswork involved. We didn't know if we'd even get through in places. So there was quite a bit of tinkering with the route beforehand and still plenty of question marks. At some point the route we'd drawn up in Garmin Basecamp merged into the Slovenian TED. And as often happens, our route ended up feeling very much like the TED. That meant we had a bit of everything. Wide gravel motorways, tiny strips of tarmac winding through small villages and over hills, muddy trails, forest paths, you name it, it was there. In total, we've done about 750 kilometers so far. The return leg's still ahead, so by the end it'll be roughly 1200 kilometers. Sounds laughable for a whole week, I know, but when you plan for the smallest, most out-of-the-way roads, you just don't cover ground quickly. It simply takes time. We crossed eastern Slovenia through some of the most uninhabited wild areas in the country. On some days we saw more deer or hinds than people, but the folks you do meet are incredibly friendly. So honestly, if you get the chance, give Slovenia's back roads a go. We carried on, navigating as we went, until we reached the TED proper. And I'd say that's the perfect point to kick off this test ride video.
Und da würde ich sagen, legen wir los mit diesem Testvideo.
So, willkommen im...
Right then, welcome to the saddle of the new Himalayan. We're just trundling along a little lane here, which is pretty typical of the kind we've ridden so far, complete with massive puddles of mud. Navigation says we go this way. These are the kinds of challenges you face when you don't know the route. And that's where I'm glad to be on something as straightforward as the Himalayan, because even in this slow, easygoing sort of riding, that's a huge plus. You feel properly at home on it. First of all, the engine, no, it's not a powerhouse, but it does everything you need. For instance, in first gear, which on many bikes is quite snappy, here I can pretty much take one hand off the bars. Well, more down to me than the bike, and just let it pull me along in first without fuss. I'd say the motor's comfortable zone starts at around 2000 revolutions per minute. From there, it works fine, you'll hear it. It does get a slightly tinny note, but at around 3000 revs, that's where it really feels happiest. From there, it pulls nicely. Of course, if you want to pick up the pace, the engine does like some revs. We're about to hit a slightly bigger road. Even at low speeds, when you're steering through the pegs, the bike responds very well because it's not too heavy and has a fairly low center of gravity. So even at a crawl, you can pick your way through with confidence. The clutch bites nicely. It's a forgiving slipper clutch too, which is a real bonus when downshifting. And then bang, you're away again. Yeah, you just amble along, nice and relaxed. As I said, when a trip throws the unknown at you, you want to be on something dependable, and that's exactly what the Himalayan feels like. The suspension at slow speeds is soft enough to be comfortable, but it's also very stable. Now we're on a wider road, I can give it a bit more throttle. It's actually quite pleasant how briskly you can go while still sitting down. The bike doesn't beat you up. It offers a really good balance between comfort and stability. On very small, sharper bumps, yes, there are higher quality suspension setups out there, but then you have to remind yourself just how little money this thing costs. For that modest sum, it's a cracking bit of suspension.
Und da hat sich das Mikrofon verabschiedet.
And just here, the microphone gave up. What I was saying is that the Himalayan gives you ample space for your legs and allows a clean, secure knee grip. You can stay completely relaxed in the saddle, as I'm showing here. The handlebar's position is spot on, not too high and touring-like, but not too low either. At 1.85 meters, I can either cruise along upright with a straight back or lean forward into attack mode to really feel connected to the front end. The motor copes with all those riding styles, never giving any jerks or bad manners. If you want to play with traction though, you do need a few revs. The single cylinder gives decent shove from the mid-range, but for drifts you need to pick the right gear and be in the top third of the rev band. Because the bike's size and power are quite modest, those drift attempts are far less intimidating and risky than they would be on a big adventure bike. Gear shifts, nothing to moan about there. The 6-speed box is precise, the shifts have a nice positive feel, the slipper clutch is light and forgiving, and you can just roll off the throttle briefly to slot the next gear in smoothly without using the clutch. No false neutrals, no nasty crunches. Overall, it's a solid performer in all sorts of riding situations, especially for something that's actually pretty affordable. And in terms of kit, it's not shy for this price range either. Just looking at the Himalayan, you can see it's well set up for a lot of different uses, especially off-road. You've got crash bars straight from the factory. There's also a proper sump guard. As standard, the chain guard and guide are fitted too, which you don't often get at this price point. And with the high mud guard, it's clearly aimed at off-road use, although the low mud guard does its job too. On this trip though, I had my first negative experience with the low mud guard. My Tenere has one as well, but this time here the front wheel swallowed a chunk of wood, which then jammed under the mudguard and snapped one of the plastic struts on the other side. Luckily, a friendly Slovenian farmer was there to sort it out on the spot with his own handiwork. So good as new again for proper off-road use. The only thing I'd say is really missing are hand guards. I definitely fit those. The foot pegs have removable rubber inserts, so you can get nice grip when you need it. Moving to the back end, under this bag you've got a luggage rack, so it's well thought out. Royal Enfield's own accessories list includes aluminium panniers, but we deliberately chose not to take those because off-road weight is king. Instead, we went for soft luggage from Enduristan, a Tornado roll bag. The tail is very minimalistic, which I think looks good, but most soft luggage systems need some sort of side support on the inside. Here the bags were threatening to sag inwards under the tail. If the rear wheel compresses on a bump, that could end badly if something gets caught. I solved it very simply, just a couple of bungee cords over the top. That lifted and tightened everything, so it worked fine. In the end, we could still use the bags we know suit our needs perfectly. Why soft luggage at all? Not just because it's lighter, but also because instead of having racks and frames and so on that make a hard luggage setup tall and wide, here all the weight sits much closer to the bike, which is far better. That's especially true off-road, when you're shifting weight from one peg to the other. With weight hanging far back, it swings like a hammer, which isn't a nice feeling. This setup was far better balanced, and the packing rule is always the same. Light stuff up top, heavy stuff down low. There are also some small dividers you can get from Touratech, which are handy. Up top, things like sunglasses, underwear, whatever. And down below, now here's the important bit, tools. Because even in that regard, the Himalayan does a great job, even compared to bigger, much pricier bikes. The onboard toolkit actually deserves to be called a toolkit. You can at least remove the rear wheel and you've got various spanners and so on. The only thing I'd recommend is getting a 17mm Allen key for the front axle, but otherwise it's a decent set, and that sturdiness runs right through the bike from the bolted on rear subframe to the front end, which feels properly robust. So yes, the Himalayan's equipment is well suited for travel and going off the beaten track.
Reise- und Offroad gerecht.
One thing that sometimes held me back on the Himalayan was the stock tire. It's an Indian-made seat tire, I'd call it a 90-10, and we already knew from talking to people who've ridden the TET in Slovenia that if there's even a bit of damp or wet weather, it gets seriously tricky because of the mud. So we decided to fit some proper tires, and that's what really unlocked the Himalayan's full off-road potential. We went for Mittas Enduro Trail XT Plus in the Dhaka version, the heavy-duty spec, a bit more robust, a bit chunkier tread. And it was the right call because on our more demanding sections, which was about as extreme as we wanted to go on what was still a trip, not a hardcore enduro baths, we had stretches of single track, went cross country through woods looking for short links between two trails. So we had our share of little adventures over the days. And this tire really showed what it can do. Some of you might know it as the Mittas E09 because Mittas recently renamed the range. This is the successor to the E09, which we'd already used at the Sika raid in Bosnia, and it served us well there too, same here. Obviously, every tire has its limits. We came across some red clay that reminded me of what I've seen in Australian videos. They call it red ice, sticky stuff that clogs everything up. We found some of that in Slovenia, and yes, the tire packed solid and that was game over. But apart from that, it worked brilliantly. And it works even better if you drop the pressure a bit. At first, after the tire change, we still had full road pressure. In that case, it was almost too twitchy, especially at the front. Wanted to follow every rut. With a bit less pressure, say 2 bar or a touch lower, it also sits better on tarmac, gives a smoother turn in. That matched the bike better because the Himalayan isn't the most agile thing on the road. So it was odd having a not very agile bike on a hyper twitchy front tire. With less pressure, they gelled nicely. And in the dirt, the tire conformed beautifully to rocks, mud, gravel. We gave it a fair hammering. Worth noting too, you can get the Enfield with either tubeless rims or tube-type rims, so you really do have full choice there. And of course, the best thing about fitting those tires was that we could finally see what the Himalayan's other components are capable of in moderately challenging terrain. We climbed some tricky slopes cleanly.
Extrem sauber hochgefahren.
So how does it handle when things get gnarly? Well, to start with, there were some critical voices after the launch saying it's not as light as some people would like, and even the older 411 Himalayan with much less power was relatively heavy for what it offered. So no, it's not a featherweight, 200 kilos plus a bit of luggage, but it's genuinely easy going to ride. Why? First, the ergonomics, which I've already mentioned, are really well sorted. Despite the small capacity, it's not a bike for small riders. At my height, I fit perfectly, and when the going gets rough, there's enough room to move forward into an attack stance. The handlebar is just high enough to stand comfortably, and if I want to shift my weight forward and drop my heels, that works perfectly. That means you can get into a proper riding position and just let the engine pull. It's not a sporty lump. I said that at the first test. It's no galloping stallion. 40 horsepower shifting 200 kilos isn't going to set your hair on fire. But it's like an alpine mule, if you like, stable and unflappable. With good riding position and room to move and a lower build than bigger adventure bikes, the center of gravity is naturally lower. So you can use that to your advantage, stand, balance on the pegs and keep the throttle open. Second gear, sometimes first everything's mild enough that nothing feels too short geared or snappy, and there's enough torque that even at idle, just on tick over, it will keep pushing the bike forward. So there's enough grunt to get up steeper climbs, and in those slippery, greasy conditions we had, you can trust it to pull you through. The other star in this environment is the suspension. It's not the plushest in this price range. You still feel the smaller hits, especially on hard, uneven surfaces, so it's no magic carpet. But it's very stable, even over bigger waves at a brisker pace. If you hit a rock you didn't see, it won't bottom out, front or rear, even with extra weight. Really stable. I've even been able to sit down on a rutted forest track and carry on without the bike getting unsettled. Everything stays composed, planted online. And that's a big advantage when things get tricky. You can keep momentum, carry speed, knowing it's going to hold its course. That stable suspension, the well thought out ergonomics and the friendly yet still torquey engine all combine to give what I think is the Himalayan's biggest strength and probably a major buying reason for many people, the sheer confidence it inspires. Confidence in the ride, in how it behaves, even in trickier situations. It's lower, it's stable. The seat height is 825 millimeters in the low setting, 845 in the high, which is how I've been riding it. That's ideal because if things get hairy, you can just sit down and pedal along calmly. But a lot of the time, thanks to that security, you don't even need to sit. Even if in the mud the rear steps out slightly on a slippery rock, you still feel in control. It's so stable and low enough that the mass feels very manageable. You don't panic, you don't drop into the seat suddenly, and it's that panic that often leads to mistakes. Now in the real slop, I'll admit I didn't have the guts to stand all the way through, but even so you feel far more secure than on a big heavy adventure bike. That weight and that relatively low build give you so much reassurance. Even in non-critical off-road sections where you're more likely to get a bit overconfident, that comes through. Valentin and I found ourselves trying to drift through gravel bends, and I noticed something. When we swapped bikes, me on the Tiger and him on the Himalayan, I could barely keep up with him despite having a lot more power. I simply didn't have the same confidence. I struggled more on the Tiger, bigger, heavier, stronger, even with its higher end components and excellent suspension. I couldn't bring myself to throw it into the gravel the way I could on the Himalayan. And if a bike can give you that much confidence, even outside your comfort zone, that's a massive plus in my book, which brings us to its main intended use, travel mixed with off-road and whether it holds up. Because obviously with a price tag under £7,000, you might wonder, can it really last? Where's the catch? What's the weak point in terms of quality? Used as intended, traveling and venturing off the beaten track, does it stand up? Well, there are a few things that remind you of its price bracket. The finish or the feel of some buttons and the joystick isn't top drawer. Sometimes there are slight alignment differences, like one crash bar sitting a bit further out than the other. In those details, yes, you can see it's a budget bike. But I tend to weigh all of those niggles against the price. For example, yes, the brake lever could have a firmer bite point instead of a slightly soft feel. Yes, the switchgear could feel a bit nicer. A few fit and finish details could be sharper. But honestly, who cares at the end of the day if the thing holds up and rides well? That's my take on it. Some of you might well say, no, I want it all to be spot on. Fair enough. But it's not badly made, far from it. There are more expensive bikes out there that aren't much better in these areas. If you go hunting for flaws, you'll find them. But in our case, it took everything we threw at it without complaint. The only minor issue was when the front wheel speed sensor got clogged with mud. It threw up a warning, but once it freed itself, the warning disappeared. Otherwise, the electronics behaved perfectly. Occasionally, the display would say you can't change riding mode and to turn the ignition off and back on. But you do that and it's fine. No big deal. Beyond that, nothing worked loose from vibration, nothing broke. The only other incident was a bent gear lever, and I've no idea where it happened. We were riding a little cross-country stretch through taller grass and I must have caught it on something. Suddenly, it was sticking out. And when you look at that lever, just a bit of simple steel, you could say it's a cheap build, but you could also say it's an advantage. If it bends, you can straighten it with your foot. And if it snaps, it's basic steel. Anyone in any village can fix it. A cast aluminium lever on a premium bike, if that breaks, you're stuck. No village blacksmith is repairing that. So in that sense, the simpler construction is actually a plus for anyone heading into more remote, adventurous areas. And as for gripes that stand regardless of the price, there are only a couple. And even then, I end up qualifying them. First, I love that this bike at this price has something as clever as the so-called triple dash, basically Google Maps navigation right on the display in 3D. I think it's brilliant because I use Google Maps all the time. Normally I've got my phone mounted on the bars, but of course it's much neater if it's in the dash. And it works fine. The only problem is you can't lock the phone screen while it's running on the display. It stays on in a sort of semi-locked state, and that drains the battery quickly. It'd be nicer if it worked differently. It's a minor point, but it's there. Otherwise, the electronics are intuitive, the controls straightforward. Changing modes is easy, though it resets when you turn the ignition off and you can swap between performance and eco. Eco mode has only 24 horsepower, like the old 411 Himalayan. I never used it because performance mode is already so gentle. Even if you're heavy-handed with the throttle, it's easy to modulate. The second potential negative depends on what sort of rider you are. And this takes us towards the conclusion, who is this Himalayan for? If the heart of riding for you is the engine, how it feels, how it delivers, how it sounds, then this Himalayan isn't for you. This motor is approachable, very well behaved, torquey enough but not emotional. It sounds somewhere between a lawnmower and a sewing machine.
hat auch nicht wirklich ein...
It's not got a punch or a change in the torque curve that makes you grin and think, here we go. No, it just does its job reliably and it works. And yes, the performance is enough to have fun with, but you'll need to get your emotional kick from something other than the engine. In my case, that came from the balance the Himalayan nails, as I said at the start, the sheer amount of bike you get for your money. On the motorway with 6 gears, it'll cruise at motorway speeds. Sure, the engine's revving a bit higher than ideal, but it copes. The wind protection from the stock screen isn't great, but that's an easy upgrade. Then it'd be sorted there too. Beyond that, it's stable enough on B roads to flow through bends nicely, it's relaxed for light off-road, capable in more demanding off-road, and always inspires confidence. And I think that's the key. When you've got confidence, you've got no fear. And when you've got no fear, you have fun. That's where the enjoyment comes from for me. Whatever happens on the trip, on the Himalayan, I feel calm and in control. And then you remember, this is under 7,000 pounds. If you can live with a not very exciting engine and this level of performance, and you want something for travel, you hardly need to think twice. The Himalayan is a cracking bike that does it all.
So those were our impressions and why we think it's such a great value bike. Hopefully I've got that across. If you've got questions, drop them in the comments. If you've already tried the new Himalayan yourself, let us know how you got on. Thanks for watching. We are heading home on the motorway now. It's been a great week and I hope that came through in the video. Cheers, see you next time. Viert euch and na svidenia.